The baby is born and everyone goes silent. The midwife looks, checks, then raises her head and tells you, "A son, your first son." And in that moment, everything changes. No joy, no congratulations, just silence and your wife holding the baby while tears stream down her face. Because you live in Carthage, 300 BCE, and according to Phoenician law, the firstborn male child belongs to the god Moloch. You will feed him for 40 days. You will name him. You will love him. Then the priests will come, and you will surrender him to the bronze statue's arms, into the fire, alive. This isn't a choice. This is law. The firstborn male child is Moloch's share, state the temple inscriptions. Rich, poor, nobles, merchants, everyone. No exceptions. If you have only one child, you give that child. The first male child always belongs to God. But here's the secret. Is this only during times of crisis, or always? The archaeological findings are shocking. In Carthage's Tophet burial grounds, thousands of small urns, each containing burned infant bones, some newborn, some a few months old, all killed in ritual fires. Israel's Tanakh says that Phoenician peoples would sacrifice their children by burning. For 2,000 years, historians said, propaganda, slander cast against an enemy. Now there are bones, and denial is impossible. Tonight I'll tell you Carthage's darkest secret, Moloch's fire, and the thousands of babies who burned in it, because sometimes the most horrifying stories are true. Before diving into what may be history's most controversial archaeological finding, if you enjoy learning about the hidden and often disturbing truths of ancient civilizations, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these difficult chapters together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared need to understand what humans are capable of, both magnificent and monstrous. Let's start with what we know for certain. Carthage was founded around 814 BCE by Phoenician colonists from Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. It grew to become one of the ancient Mediterranean's greatest powers, controlling vast trade networks, establishing colonies throughout North Africa, Spain, and the western Mediterranean islands, and eventually challenging Rome itself for dominance of the ancient world. The Carthaginians were sophisticated urban dwellers. They had advanced architecture, created one of antiquity's most powerful navies, developed complex systems of government and law, made innovations in agriculture and irrigation, and traded goods from as far away as Britain and sub-Saharan Africa. This was not a primitive society by any measure. They were cultural and technological equals to the Greeks and Romans, their great rivals. And according to both ancient literary sources and modern archaeological evidence, they also practiced child sacrifice on a scale that may have been unparalleled in the ancient world. The ancient testimony comes from multiple sources, none of them Carthaginian. Carthage was destroyed so thoroughly by Rome that virtually no Carthaginian texts survive. What we have are descriptions from Greek and Roman writers, all of whom were hostile to Carthage. This is why, for centuries, historians dismissed their accounts as propaganda, wartime slander designed to demonize an enemy. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, provided one of the most detailed accounts. He described how, during a military crisis in 310 BCE when Syracuse was threatening Carthage, the city's elite believed their god was angry because they had been sending slave children to be sacrificed instead of their own offspring. In response, they sacrificed 200 children from the noblest families and another 300 were voluntarily offered, making a total of 500 victims in a single ceremony. The Roman historian Plutarch described seeing a bronze statue of the god with outstretched hands sloping downward toward a bronze brazier filled with fire. Children placed in the statue's arms would roll down into the flames. He claimed that mothers were forbidden from crying and that drums were beaten loudly to drown out the screams. The Hebrew Bible contains multiple references to child sacrifice practiced by Phoenician-related peoples. The books of Kings mention the practice of making children pass through fire to Moloch in the valley of Ben Hinnom near Jerusalem. The prophet Jeremiah condemned this practice repeatedly, suggesting it was well known and ongoing. For 2 millennia, modern scholars largely rejected these accounts. The reasoning seemed sound. These were written by enemies of Carthage, people with every reason to portray them as barbaric. Child sacrifice was such an obviously monstrous practice that surely it must be exaggerated or fabricated entirely. Civilized peoples wouldn't do such things, right? Then in 1921, French archaeologists working in Carthage discovered something that changed everything: the Tophet. A Tophet is a type of sanctuary where child sacrifice victims were buried. The name comes from the Hebrew Bible's references to the Tophet in the Valley of Hinnom. The Carthaginian Tophet was a large open-air precinct filled with thousands of stone markers, beneath which were buried ceramic urns containing cremated remains. The initial excavations were limited, but over the following decades, more extensive work revealed revealed the staggering scale of the site. Thousands upon thousands of urns, each containing burned bones. And as osteological analysis improved, it became possible to determine whose bones they were, mostly infants, ranging from newborns to children about 4 years old, though the majority were younger than 2. Not all urns contained human remains. Some held the bones of lambs or kids, young goats. This was actually noted by ancient sources, which claimed that wealthy families would sometimes substitute animal sacrifices for their children. The presence of both animal and human remains in the Tophet seemed to confirm rather than contradict the ancient accounts. The stone markers above the urns often bore inscriptions. These were votive dedications, similar to offerings at any ancient sanctuary, but their content was chilling. To the Lord Baal Hammon and to Tophet, the offering which name vowed, his own flesh and blood. His own flesh and blood was the Phoenician euphemism for a child. Other inscriptions made it even more explicit. His firstborn son, the child of his body, the fruit which Baal gave. These weren't metaphorical. They were describing actual children, burned and buried in these urns. The archaeological evidence seemed overwhelming. Thousands of cremated infant remains buried in a sacred precinct, with votive inscriptions explicitly referencing child sacrifice, at a site in Carthage, exactly matching the descriptions in ancient literary sources. Case closed, right? Not quite. The discovery of the Tophet ignited one of archaeology's most intense and long-lasting controversies, one that continues to this day. A significant group of scholars, particularly from the Mediterranean region, argued that the Tophet was not a sacrifice site but a specialized cemetery for children who died naturally. Infant mortality in the ancient world was extremely high, perhaps 20 to 30% or even higher. Families might have created a special burial ground for these tragic losses, with the elaborate urns and inscriptions representing mourning rituals rather than sacrifice. This interpretation was supported by several arguments. First, the sheer number of remains seemed too high. If these were all sacrifices, Carthage would have been sacrificing thousands of children, an unsustainable practice. Second, analysis of some bones showed signs of disease or malnutrition, suggesting these children had died from natural causes. Third, the inscriptions could be interpreted differently, perhaps offered meant dedicated in memory of rather than literally sacrificed. The debate became intense, even bitter. Some saw it as Western scholars being too ready to believe the worst about non-European civilizations, accepting hostile propaganda at face value. Others saw it as modern scholars being unwilling to accept that sophisticated, civilized ancient peoples could commit such atrocities. The controversy has never been fully resolved, but recent scientific advances have tilted the evidence heavily toward the sacrifice interpretation. Let's examine the key findings. First, detailed osteological analysis of the bones has shown that the vast majority show no signs of disease. These weren't sickly children who died from illness. They were healthy infants who died suddenly, consistent with being killed for sacrifice. Second, the age distribution is suspicious. If this were a normal cemetery for children who died from natural causes, you'd expect a random age distribution. Instead, there's a clear concentration of children under 6 months old, with another peak around 2 to 3 years. This pattern makes more sense if children were being sacrificed at specific ages for ritual purposes. Third, the burning pattern is distinctive. The bones were exposed to very high temperatures, much higher than typical cremation. This suggests they were burned in specialized ritual contexts, not simple funeral pyres. Some bones show evidence of having been burned while the flesh was still on them, meaning the children were burned alive or immediately after death, not after decomposition. Fourth, there's the sheer consistency across multiple sites. Tophets have been found not just in Carthage, but throughout the Phoenician and Punic world, in Sicily, Sardinia, Tunisia, and other North African coastal sites. All show the same characteristics: thousands of infant remains, cremated at high temperatures, buried in urns with votive inscriptions, in sacred precincts. This systematic pattern across hundreds of years and thousands of miles is hard to explain as merely a burial practice for naturally deceased infants. Fifth, the inscriptions themselves, when examined closely by Semitic language experts, really do seem to describe sacrifice. The terminology used parallels sacrifice language in other Phoenician religious texts. When the inscriptions say offered to Baal, they mean it in the same sense as offered a lamb or offered incense, given as a sacrifice. Sixth, and perhaps most compelling, we have the ancient literary sources that describe this practice in detail from multiple independent authors spanning several centuries. While we should always be skeptical of hostile sources, when archaeological evidence so closely matches their descriptions, it becomes harder to dismiss them as pure propaganda. So the current scholarly consensus, though not unanimous, leans toward accepting that child sacrifice did occur in Carthage and other Phoenician Punic settlements, though debate continues about its frequency and the exact circumstances under which it was practiced. With that established, established, let's return to our opening scenario and explore what this practice actually meant for the people who lived under it. Imagine you're a Carthaginian merchant in the 3rd century BCE. Your wife has just given birth to your first child, a son. Your family is delighted, a male heir to carry on the family business and name. But underneath the joy is a terrible awareness. According to ancient tradition and possibly religious law, this child belongs to Baal Hammon, the chief god of Carthage, sometimes identified with the child-consuming deity called Moloch in Hebrew texts. Whether you must sacrifice him immediately or only in times of crisis, or perhaps never if you choose to interpret the tradition flexibly, depends on factors we can't fully reconstruct. The evidence suggests the practice varied over time and circumstance. What we do know is that for at least some periods of Carthaginian history, sacrificing firstborn sons was expected, either routinely or during emergencies. For a wealthy family, there were options, all of them morally compromising. You could purchase a slave child and substitute them for your own son. Ancient sources mention this practice explicitly. It was apparently common enough that during the crisis of 310 BCE, the city's elite felt guilty about having done this and decided to sacrifice their own children to appease angry gods. But substitution required wealth. Poor families couldn't afford to buy slave children. For them, if the law or custom demanded the firstborn son, they had no alternative. Their child would be taken. Let's imagine you're from a poor family with no resources to purchase a substitute. Your son is now 40 days old. That seems to have been a significant milestone in Carthaginian practice. The child had survived the most dangerous early period when infant mortality was highest. He had been named. He had been integrated into the family. And now, according to tradition, he would be offered to the god. The process probably followed a ritual pattern. Priests would be informed. A date would be set, likely coordinating with religious festivals or significant calendar days. You would bring the child to the Tophet, the sacred precinct outside the city walls where the sacrifices took place. The Tophet was an open-air sanctuary, not a temple. Archaeological remains show it was filled with stone markers, representing thousands of previous offerings. Walking through it, you would be surrounded by the memorials of countless other families who had done what you were about to do. This was normalized, ritualized, made sacred through repetition and communal participation. At the center of the Tophet stood the statue, or more accurately, a bronze brazier in the form of a deity. Ancient descriptions suggest it was large, depicting Baal Hammon, or Moloch, or Kronos, depending on which source you read, with arms extended forward and slightly downward. The interior of the statue and the outstretched arms would be heated by a massive fire beneath. Musicians would be present, specifically drummers. Multiple ancient sources mention this detail. Drums beaten loudly to drown out the sounds of children crying or screaming. This served both practical and ritual purposes. Practically, it spared the families and attendees the trauma of hearing the child's distress. Ritually, it maintained the sacred, controlled atmosphere of the ceremony. A screaming child would have made the participants confront the horror of what they were doing. The drums allowed them to dissociate from that reality. The actual sacrifice might have proceeded in several ways, based on different ancient descriptions and archaeological evidence. One account describes children being placed in the heated bronze arms and rolling into the fire. The high-temperature cremation evident in the bones supports this. Another describes throats being cut before the burning. Some bones show no trauma beyond the burning, suggesting the children might have been alive when burned. Others show cut marks on neck vertebrae, suggesting ritual throat cutting first. Which method was used might have varied by period, by family preference, if any choice was given, or by the type of ceremony. A routine sacrifice during peacetime might have been conducted differently than a mass sacrifice during a crisis. We simply don't know. After the burning, the remains would be collected and placed in ceramic urns. These urns varied in quality, from simple vessels for poor families to elaborate decorated urns for the wealthy. The urns were buried in the Tophet, and a stone marker was placed above them. The family would commission an inscription on the marker, commemorating the offering. These inscriptions are heartbreaking to read, even in translation. They're written in the formal language of religious dedication, but behind the formulaic phrases, you can sense genuine loss. To the Lord Baal, what name vowed, his own son, his flesh and blood. The very precision of the language, clarifying that this was his own child, not a substitute, suggests that substitution was common enough that clarification was needed. Some markers include longer inscriptions, almost like epitaphs. Hear my voice, Baal, and bless him. Who is being blessed? The dead child? The parent asking for divine favor in exchange for this sacrifice? Both? The ambiguity might be intentional, a way to process the unbearable act through religious framing. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this practice to continue for centuries deserve examination. How did parents convince themselves to do this? How did communities normalize child child sacrifice. First, there was the religious conviction that this was necessary and divinely mandated. If you truly believed that Baal demanded the sacrifice, that the city's prosperity and safety depended on appeasing the god, that refusing would bring divine wrath upon everyone, then sacrifice became a duty rather than a choice. You weren't murdering your child. You were fulfilling a sacred obligation, painful as it might be. Second, there was the precedent of tradition. This is how things had always been done. Thousands of other families had made the same sacrifice. The Tophet stood as physical evidence of this continuity. Your personal suffering was part of a larger pattern that had sustained Carthage for centuries. Fighting against it meant challenging not just current practice but the entire religious and social foundation of your civilization. Third, there was the consolation that your child was serving a higher purpose. Unlike a child who simply died from disease, your son would become part of the divine realm, eternally associated with the god to whom he was offered. Some inscriptions suggest parents believed the sacrificed children would be honored in the afterlife, elevated above ordinary mortals. Fourth, there was social pressure and the risk of being seen as impious. If tradition or law demanded this sacrifice and you refused, you weren't just defying religious authority but marking yourself as someone who valued your personal feelings above communal good. In a society where social standing and community acceptance were crucial for survival, this would have been a terrifying prospect. Fifth, there was the possibility that the alternative was worse. If Carthage was under military threat, plague, or famine, the circumstances in which mass sacrifices were most likely, then you were choosing between your child and the potential destruction of everyone you loved. The sacrifice might have seemed like the lesser evil, the price that had to be paid to save the many. None of these rationalizations make the practice less horrifying to modern moral sensibilities, but understanding them helps explain how intelligent, emotionally normal people convince themselves to do something that seems incomprehensible. It's also worth noting that there's evidence some Carthaginians were troubled by the practice. The very fact that wealthy families often substituted slave children suggests they found it difficult to sacrifice their own. The guilt reported in 310 BCE, when the elite felt they had offended the gods by using substitutes, reveals a community struggling with the moral implications of what they were doing. Some Carthaginian expatriates who moved to other Mediterranean cities might have abandoned the practice, though evidence for this is limited. And when Carthage eventually fell to Rome and the practice ended, there's no record of any attempt to revive it in the successor Punic communities. This might suggest that it was maintained by social and religious pressure rather than genuine universal conviction. The Roman destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE ended the practice in North Africa, though it may have continued for some time in Phoenician communities in Sicily and Sardinia until they too were absorbed into the Roman world. The Tophet sanctuaries were abandoned and gradually forgotten, buried under centuries of deposits. When they were rediscovered in the 20th century, they became focal points for one of archaeology's most passionate debates. As we discussed earlier, the controversy centers on whether these were really sacrifice sites or simply specialized cemeteries for naturally deceased children. The scholars who argue for the cemetery interpretation often do so from admirable motivations: a resistance to accepting hostile propaganda at face value, a concern about projecting modern horror onto ancient practices we don't fully understand, a desire to see ancient peoples, especially non-Western peoples, as more humane than their enemies claimed. But the evidence has increasingly supported the sacrifice interpretation, to the point where denying it requires dismissing consistent patterns across multiple lines of evidence. The bones, the inscriptions, the archaeological context, the literary sources all point in the same direction. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth: sophisticated, advanced civilizations can commit systematic atrocities. Technological development doesn't guarantee moral development. Cultural refinement doesn't prevent cruelty. Intelligence and artistry can coexist with horrors that make us recoil. Carthage built magnificent architecture, established trade networks spanning continents, produced literature and philosophy, though almost none survives, created beautiful art, developed advanced agriculture, and challenged Rome itself for Mediterranean dominance. They were, by any reasonable definition, a highly advanced civilization. And if the evidence is correct, they also burned thousands of babies alive over hundreds of years in religious rituals that gradually became normalized, routinized, transformed from moral horror into sacred duty. This reality forces us to confront our own assumptions about civilization and barbarism. We like to imagine a clear line between advanced peoples who don't do such things and primitive peoples who might. But that line doesn't exist. Nazi Germany was one of Europe's most educated and culturally sophisticated nations. The transatlantic slave trade was conducted by the world's most technologically advanced maritime powers. Industrial capitalism's early phase involved horrific child labor conditions in the most economically developed nations. The patterns repeat across history. Advanced civilizations finding ways to rationalize and systematize cruelty, often directing it at the most vulnerable: children, slaves, outsiders, the poor. The methods change, the justifications evolve, but the fundamental dynamic persists. The babies burned in Moloch's fires deserve to be remembered, not as statistics in an archaeological debate, but as individuals whose lives were stolen for beliefs we now recognize as false. Each one experienced terror and pain. Each one had parents who made an impossible choice under crushing social and religious pressure. Each one was human, valuable, worthy of life. We don't know their names. The inscriptions identify the parents who offered them, not the children who died. This erasure is typical of how victims of systematic violence disappear from history. The perpetrators and beneficiaries of systems leave records. The victims often don't. But we can still honor their memory by telling their story honestly, by not sugarcoating or dismissing the evidence, by acknowledging that this happened and that it was wrong, by any reasonable moral standard. We can resist the temptation to rationalize it away, to claim it must have been something less horrible than it appears, to protect our image of ancient Carthage or ancient Phoenicia from this dark truth. The Tophet markers still stand in museums, silent testimony to children who died 2,000 plus years ago in rituals their society deemed necessary and sacred. When you see them, remember that beneath each marker was an urn containing the burned bones of a child who experienced the same fear and pain that children today would experience in similar circumstances. The centuries that separate us don't diminish their suffering or make it less worthy of acknowledgement and grief. The practice of child sacrifice wasn't unique to Carthage. It appears in various forms across many ancient cultures: Canaanite, Phoenician, Israelite, condemned by prophets, suggesting it occurred, pre-Columbian American, and others. The specifics varied, but the basic pattern recurred. Societies under stress turning to the sacrifice of children as a solution to crisis, a way to appease demanding gods, a demonstration of ultimate devotion. What made Carthage notable was the scale and systematization. The Tophet burial grounds contain thousands of remains spanning centuries. This wasn't occasional sacrifice during extreme emergencies. This was an institutionalized practice, embedded in religious ritual and possibly religious law, conducted regularly enough to require specialized sacred precincts for disposing of the remains. The question, why did they do it, has no fully satisfying answer. The religious motivations are clear from inscriptions and ancient sources. They believed Baal Hammon or other gods demanded these offerings, and that providing them would ensure the city's prosperity, military success, and protection from disaster. But why would gods demand child sacrifice? Because humans created gods who demanded what humans were already inclined to do. In societies where children, especially those from poor or enslaved families, were considered less valuable than adults, where infant mortality was so high that emotional investment in newborns might have been complicated, where communal survival trumped individual rights, the idea of sacrificing children could emerge and be sacralized. Once established, the practice perpetuated itself through the mechanisms we discussed: tradition, social pressure, religious conviction, communal guilt. If everyone participates, no one individual bears full responsibility. And the sunk cost fallacy: if we've already sacrificed thousands, stopping now would mean those deaths were meaningless. The end of the practice came through conquest. Rome destroyed Carthage so thoroughly that the famous quote attributed to Cato the Elder, "Carthage must be destroyed," became synonymous with complete and utter annihilation. The city was burned, the population was killed or enslaved, the site was symbolically plowed and cursed. Whether child sacrifice played a role in Roman propaganda justifying this total destruction is unclear, but it certainly would have provided convenient justification. With Carthage gone and Phoenician power broken, the practice ended. Successor Punic communities under Roman rule didn't revive it, either because Roman law prohibited it or because the religious and social structures that had maintained it no longer existed. The Tophet sanctuaries were abandoned and forgotten, until 2,000 years later, archaeologists began uncovering them, bringing back to light a practice that challenges our understanding of what civilization means and what humans are capable of doing when convinced that it's necessary, sacred, or beneficial to the community. The babies in the urns were real, their deaths were real, their suffering was real, and their story, however uncomfortable, deserves to be told. Not to condemn modern Tunisia or Lebanon, whose peoples bear no responsibility for what happened millennia ago in related ancient cultures. Not to single out Carthage as uniquely evil when child sacrifice appears in many ancient societies' histories, but to remember that the victims existed, that their deaths mattered, and that humanity's capacity for systematizing and normalizing horror must be acknowledged if we hope to recognize and resist it in our own time. The drums that drowned out the children's cries 2,300 years ago have modern equivalents. The ways we drown out the voices of the vulnerable, the mechanisms we use to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities, the techniques we employ to diffuse responsibility so no one individual has to face the full moral weight of systematic cruelty. Moloch's fires are cold behold now. The bronze statue is long gone, melted down and repurposed. The Tophet sanctuaries are archaeological sites, tourist destinations, subjects of academic papers. But the fundamental patterns they represent, the sacrifice of the vulnerable for the perceived benefit of the powerful, the religious or ideological justification of cruelty, the communal normalization of the unthinkable, those patterns remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Carthage. Remember the babies in the urns. Remember that sophisticated civilizations can do monstrous things. Remember that every age has its blind spots. And remember that the same mechanisms that allowed Carthaginian parents to place their children in Moloch's burning arms exist in human nature still, waiting for the right combination of stress, belief, and social pressure to activate them again in new forms. The children deserve that much, to be remembered, to have their suffering acknowledged, and to serve as eternal warning about what humans are capable of when we forget that every life, especially the most vulnerable lives, has inherent worth that no god, tradition, or communal need can override.